Dawn broke over Fort Bragg like a weary soldier, slow deliberate with a quiet dignity that belied its strength. The North Carolina pines stood sentinel along the perimeter, their shadows stretching across the compound like memories of fallen men. This place had seen generations of America's finest trained bleed and depart for battlefields, whose names mark the chapters of our nation's military history: Normandy, Korea; Grenada, Desert Storm; Mogadishu, Fallujah, Kandahar. The buildings themselves, weathered brick and steel, had absorbed decades of bootsteps, commands, and the silent promises of those who understood that freedom was purchased with vigilance. Through the morning mist that clung to the earth like battlefield smoke, a solitary figure emerged. Major Claire Hawkins moved with the efficient grace of someone who had learned that wasted motion could cost lives. Her ACU was perfectly pressed, the pixelated pattern of greens and tans, a reminder of more recent conflicts. The Sig Sauer P226 in her thigh holster wasn't standard issue for officers in her position, but Claire wasn't a standard officer. The weight of it against her leg was reassuring, a constant in a life where constants were rare and precious. She carried no outward signs of her true experience. No Delta Force insignia, no special operations patches, nothing that would tell the casual observer that the woman walking toward the command building had spent more time behind enemy lines than most senior officers had spent behind desks. That was intentional. Claire had learned long ago that silence was its own form of armor. Inside the briefing room, coffee steam spiraled toward the ceiling like reconnaissance drones seeking intelligence. The air smelled of caffeine floor wax and the particular brand of tension that preceded new command assignments. 5 men were already seated, the senior training cadre for the Ranger Assessment Phase program. Their postures told a story to anyone trained to read it: wary professionalism, masking territorial concern. Major General Harold Blackwood, a granite-faced veteran of Desert Storm, whose reputation had been forged in the burning oil fields of Kuwait, stood as Claire entered. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command, "meet your new oversight officer, Major Claire Hawkins." The men rose with military precision, but their eyes held questions. Claire had seen that look before in Mogadishu and Kosovo, in mountain outposts, where the very idea of a woman in combat was still viewed with suspicion that bordered on superstition. Major Hawkins's service record is partially classified. Blackwood continued, the fluorescent lights gleaming off his silver hair. "But I can tell you she's participated in operations in Mogadishu, Kosovo, and Afghanistan. The Pentagon has assigned her to evaluate our Ranger Assessment Program as part of the new Combat Integration Initiative." In the back of the room, a muscular man with a high and tight haircut and the stripes of a master sergeant shifted in his seat. Jason Reynolds, 17 years of service, former Ranger, 2 tours in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan. His face was a battlefield map of experience, a scar across his jaw from an IED in Fallujah, eyes that had seen the worst humanity could offer, and somehow remained unblinking. "With respect, sir," Reynolds said, the words polished to a deceptive shine, "we're training soldiers for battlefield conditions that don't make allowances for gender-based standards." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Claire didn't react. She'd learned that lesson in a sandstorm outside Kandahar. Emotion was a luxury afforded to those who weren't responsible for the lives of others. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "Major Hawkins will be evaluating our troops' proficiency with the M4A1 carbine and ACOG system, CQB techniques, and survival skills in hostile terrain. Last time I checked, Sergeant Reynolds, bullets don't discriminate based on the gender of the shooter." Claire stepped forward, her boots making no sound on the polished floor. Every man in the room was taking her measure, cataloging details, the way she moved, efficient, balanced, her expression controlled, observant, her hands steady, scarred across the knuckles. She knew their type, had fought beside them, had saved some, had buried others. "I'm not here to lower standards," Claire said, her voice carrying neither apology nor challenge. "I'm here to ensure they're being properly applied." She looked directly at Reynolds. "The battlefield doesn't care about tradition, Sergeant. It only cares about results." The silence that followed wasn't agreement, it was assessment. As the briefing concluded, Claire gathered her materials with practiced efficiency. Outside, the Fort Bragg training ground spread before her like a chessboard. This was where America's most elite fighting forces were forged, where theory met practice, and only the strongest emerged intact. Sergeant First Class Marcus Kelly, the sniper instructor, whose permanent squint suggested years spent sighting down scopes, lingered by the door. Pentagon's getting creative with their political appointments, he said, just loud enough for Claire to hear. She turned to face him, maintaining the precise distance that military protocol demanded. I qualified expert on my first day at the range, Sergeant. Did you? Something flickered across Kelly's face, surprise perhaps, or the recognition of a worthy opponent. He departed without another word, leaving Claire alone with Blackwood. They'll test you, the general said, staring out the window at the obstacle course where recruits were already running drills under the morning sun. Not because you're a woman, because you're an unknown. Claire nodded. I'm familiar with the ritual, sir. Blackwood turned to her, his expression unreadable. What they don't know is that sometimes the unknown is exactly what they should fear. The women's barracks at Fort Bragg were newer than most buildings on base, a tacit acknowledgement of changing times. Claire had been assigned private quarters befitting her rank, though the space was Spartan's single-bed desk, small bathroom window overlooking the eastern perimeter. She'd slept in worse places, far worse. A knock at the door interrupted her unpacking. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood in the hallway, her posture textbook perfect. Major Hawkins, she said, I've been assigned as your liaison officer during your evaluation period. Claire gestured for her to enter. Mitchell was young, early 30s at most, but her eyes held the focused intensity of someone who'd fought to earn every inch of respect. You've been here how long, Lieutenant? Claire asked, arranging her few personal items on the desk. A weathered compass, a dog-eared copy of Sun Tzu, a small metal case containing metal ribbons she never displayed. 4 years, ma'am. I'm one of 3 female training officers in the program. Claire nodded. And the reception, Mitchell's hesitation was brief but telling. Professional mostly. There are always exceptions. Reynolds and Kelly. Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. You've already identified them. It's what I was trained to do. Mitchell studied Claire with newfound curiosity. Then unexpectedly recognition dawned on her face. Wait, Mogadishu 1993. You were there, you're Ghost 6. The designation hit Claire like distant artillery fire, the sound reaching her long after the impact. She hadn't heard that call sign in years, had assumed it was buried along with so many other classified details of that operation. Where did you hear that name? Claire asked, her voice deliberately neutral. I did my master's thesis on female involvement in special operations. There were rumors, a female operator with Delta during the Black Hawk Down incident. No official confirmation, of course, but enough whispers from reliable sources. Mitchell leaned forward, lowering her voice. They said she extracted 2 downed pilots using a CAR-15 in pure nerve when their position was compromised. The memories flooded back with the force of a breached dam, the deafening percussion of gunfire echoing between Mogadishu's buildings, the copper penny smell of blood mixing with cordite, the weight of a wounded pilot across her shoulders as she navigated through streets controlled by Mohammed Farah Aidid's militia. History is often more rumor than fact, Lieutenant, Claire said, carefully replacing the metal case in her bag, especially in our line of work. Mitchell nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Some truths remain classified even in casual conversation. The first training assessment is scheduled for 0600 tomorrow at Range Complex Bravo, Mitchell said, professional once more. M4 qualification and tactical movement drills. I'll be there, Claire replied. And Lieutenant, I'd appreciate if speculation about my background remained between us. Understood, ma'am. After Mitchell departed, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress unyielding beneath her. She closed her eyes and Mogadishu rose before her like a ghost, buildings silhouetted against flames, the chattering rhythm of AK-47s, the desperate radio calls as American helicopters fell from the sky. She had been 28 then, one of the first women secretly integrated into Delta Force for a specialized role that later became officially denied. The mission had been straightforward: provide medical support and translation capabilities for a standard capture operation. Then the helicopters went down and straightforward became a bloodbath. Claire opened her eyes, forcing the memories back into their compartment. Tomorrow would require focus. Reynolds and Kelly would be watching for any sign of weakness, any justification for their preconceptions. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The sun had begun its descent toward the western edge of the base when Claire made her way to a nondescript building near the administrative sector. Unlike the other structures with their clearly marked designations, this one bore only a number and a keypad entry system. She entered a code that few at Fort Bragg would possess. Inside, Colonel Frank Sullivan looked up from his desk. At 65, Sullivan's face was a testament to a life lived in harsh conditions weathered by desert suns and mountain winds lined by decisions that had sent men to glory or graves. His hair had gone silver years ago, but his eyes remained the sharp blue of a tactical operator who missed nothing. "They told me you were coming," he said, rising to his feet with the careful movement of a man whose body had absorbed more impact than it was designed for. Didn't quite believe it until now. Claire closed the door behind her. "Hello, Frank." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. The office was deliberately ordinary, standard government furniture regulation, wall hangings. Nothing to suggest that Frank Sullivan had once commanded some of the most sensitive Delta Force operations of the late Cold War era. Nothing except the man himself. "So they finally made it official," Sullivan said, leaning back in his chair. "Women in combat roles. Only took them 30 years to acknowledge what we already knew in the field." "Progress moves at its own pace," Claire replied, taking the offered seat, "especially in institutions built on tradition." Sullivan's laugh was dry as Afghan dust. "Tradition. That's a diplomatic way of saying stubborn old men." He studied her face. "You look good, Hawkins. Life at the Pentagon must agree with you." "We both know I wasn't at the Pentagon." Sullivan's expression sobered. "No, Central and South America, if my sources are correct, still cleaning up messes that politicians pretend don't exist." Claire didn't confirm or deny. Some operational details remain classified even between former comrades. "They still don't know about Kandahar in 2002, do they?" Sullivan asked, his voice lower now. "About how you saved Bravo team when that infiltration went sideways." "That operation doesn't exist on paper," Claire said. "Neither did my role in it." Sullivan nodded, understanding perfectly. For decades, women like Claire had served in combat capacities that were officially denied ghosts in a system that wasn't ready to acknowledge them. "Why are you really here, Claire? This Ranger assessment review could be handled by any competent officer. Why send you specifically?" Claire leaned forward slightly. "Because the integration program is failing in specific areas, and they need to understand why. Women are qualifying, but not being selected. The official reasons are vague. Team cohesion concerns, adaptability questions. And the unofficial reasons, institutional resistance at the instructor level, evaluation biases, deliberate washouts." Sullivan's expression darkened. "Reynolds, you know him?" "I know the type," Sullivan replied. "Solid operator, dedicated, believes in the system as it was, not as it's becoming." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Reynolds isn't just skeptical, Claire. He's dangerous. His personnel file shows 5 female candidates washed out under his supervision in the last year alone, all for standards non-compliance." Claire absorbed this information with the clinical detachment of an intelligence analyst. "He's protecting his territory. He believes he's protecting the integrity of the force." Sullivan leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity that had once commanded elite units through impossible missions. "Be careful around him. Men like that don't change their minds easily, and they don't fight fair when they're cornered." Claire met his gaze without flinching. "Neither do I." Sullivan's weathered face creased into a slight smile. "No, you never did." He rose from his desk, moving to a small side cabinet where he extracted 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon, whose label spoke of civilian expense rather than military supply. "This isn't an official meeting, so I think we can bend regulations slightly." He poured 2 fingers in each glass, handed one to Claire. The amber liquid caught the late afternoon light filtering through the blinds. "To ghosts," Sullivan said, raising his glass slightly. "To memories," Claire replied, touching her glass to his. The bourbon burned pleasantly, a familiar sensation that recalled nights in remote outposts where such small comforts made the difference between sanity and surrender. "One last thing," Sullivan said, setting down his glass. "Whatever happens here, whatever you uncover, watch your back. The old networks still exist. Reynolds has friends at the Pentagon, men who share his views on combat integration." Claire nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. The battlefield before her wasn't just Fort Bragg's training grounds. It was the invisible terrain of military politics, institutional resistance, and the ghosts of traditions that died hard if they died at all. Morning at the shooting range carried the peculiar stillness that preceded controlled violence. Targets stood at measured distances across the field, paper silhouettes waiting to be transformed by bullets into assessments of human capability. The air smelled of oil brass and anticipation. Claire arrived precisely 15 minutes early, her inspection kit under one arm. The range master, a grizzled veteran with hands calloused by decades of weapon handling, nodded respectfully as she approached. "Morning, Major. Range is prepped to your specifications." "Thank you, Chief," Claire replied, surveying the layout. 20 shooting positions. Targets at 100, 200, 300, and 400 meters. Wind flags showing a mild 5-knot cross breeze from the east, enough to affect long-distance shots, but not enough to excuse poor marksmanship. Reynolds and Kelly arrived with the precision of men who had built their lives around military punctuality. Behind them came 6 Ranger candidates and 3 additional instructors. The candidates' faces showed the particular blend of exhaustion and alertness that characterized those in the selection process, their bodies pushed to limits, their minds trained to function regardless. "Gentlemen," Claire addressed the group, her voice carrying across the range without shouting. "Today's evaluation will cover standard M4A1 qualification with the ACOG system, followed by transition to sidearms under stress conditions." Reynolds stepped forward, positioning himself at the invisible edge of proper military distance, close enough to assert presence, not close enough to trigger formal correction. "The candidates are prepared for standard qualification, Major," he said, emphasis on her rank just subtle enough to suggest skepticism without crossing into insubordination. "Though we typically run more advanced drills at this stage." Claire met his gaze directly. "We'll begin with fundamentals. Mastery is built on basics repeatedly executed under pressure." She turned to the candidates. "You'll fire from 3 positions, standing, kneeling, and prone. 3 magazines, each standard load. I want to see proper breath control, trigger discipline, and follow through. This isn't about speed, it's about precision." The assessment began with mechanical efficiency. Each candidate cycled through the positions, their shots forming tight groupings on the targets. Claire moved behind them, observing technique rather than just results. The way they loaded, how they established cheek weld against the stock, the rhythm of their breathing between shots. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Reynolds and Kelly exchanging glances as she made notes. Their body language conveyed skepticism wrapped in professional restraint. "Candidate Wilson," Claire called, addressing a lean, focused young man whose shots had been consistently centered. "Your grouping is excellent, but you're rushing your final shot in each sequence. Control your breathing through the entire magazine." Wilson nodded, accepting the correction without defensiveness. Reynolds moved closer. "Wilson is our top shooter, Major. His qualification scores have been perfect across all evaluations." "Perfect scores can mask developing bad habits, Sergeant," Claire replied without looking up from her notes. "Habits that become fatal when conditions deteriorate." She demonstrated the proper breathing technique: inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze, then stepped back. Wilson adjusted his position slightly, applied the correction, and fired his next sequence. The grouping tightened even further. "Better," Claire said. After all candidates had completed their rotations, Claire addressed the group again. "Your technical proficiency is apparent. Now let's discuss the theory behind what you're doing." She pointed to the 400-meter target. "At this distance with a 5.56mm round, what factors most affect accuracy?" Silence greeted her question. "Wind drift," she continued. "Bullet drop due to gravity. Temperature and humidity if extreme enough. Your breathing and heartbeat. The stability of your firing platform." She looked at each candidate in turn. "You're not just shooters. You're ballistic engineers applying physics in real time, often under conditions where mistakes mean casualties." She lifted an M4 from the rack, checked it with practice movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. "The difference between firing a weapon and mastering it is understanding exactly why the bullet hits or misses." Without further commentary, Claire assumed the standing position, sighted down the ACOG, and fired a 5-round sequence at the 400-meter target. Each shot struck within the center mass, forming a group tight enough that the individual holes nearly merged. She transitioned smoothly to kneeling, repeated the performance, then to prone for a final demonstration. When she rose and returned the weapon to its rack, the silence on the range had transformed from skepticism to something approaching respect. Ballistics isn't about gender, Claire said, her voice carrying easily in the stillness. It's about physics and discipline. Reynolds' expression remained carefully neutral, but the slight tension in his jaw betrayed his thoughts. He hadn't expected this level of proficiency, had assumed perhaps that her role was political rather than operational. We'll continue with transition drills after lunch, Claire announced, and dismissed for meal break. As the candidates dispersed toward the mess hall, Kelly approached Reynolds, their voices low, but still audible to Claire's trained ear. She knows her shit, Kelly muttered. Doesn't mean she belongs here. Reynolds watched Claire gathering her materials. The range is the easy part. Let's see how she handles the SEER evaluation. Theory doesn't help much when you're cold, wet, and disoriented. Claire pretended not to hear, but filed away the exchange. Their mistake was assuming she had something to prove. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. She had something to uncover. The officers' mess hall at Fort Bragg maintained the timeless quality of military dining facilities everywhere. Institutional efficiency blended with the particular camaraderie of those who shared uncommon purpose. Claire selected a seat at the far end of a table, positioning herself to observe the room while reviewing her morning notes. Lieutenant Mitchell approached with a tray, silently requesting permission to join with a raised eyebrow. Claire nodded. Impressive demonstration at the range, Major, Mitchell said, keeping her voice casual as she arranged her meal. The candidates are talking about it. Good shooting isn't remarkable, Lieutenant. It's expected. 5 shots at 400 meters with that grouping. Mitchell smiled slightly. I'd call that beyond expected. Claire took a sip of water. How long have Reynolds and Kelly been running the assessment program? Mitchell's expression turned more serious. Reynolds came over from the 3rd group 2 years ago. Kelly arrived 6 months later. They've known each other since Afghanistan 2010. And the candidate washout rate since they arrived. Mitchell hesitated, glancing around before responding. Up 40% for female candidates, 12% for males. Claire nodded, absorbing but not reacting to the statistical confirmation of her suspicions. There's more, Mitchell continued, her voice lower now. 3 female candidates who washed out filed formal complaints, citing instructor bias. All 3 complaints were dismissed after review. Who conducted the review? Major Gerald Hoffman Reynolds, former CO from Afghanistan. The pattern was taking shape, the invisible infrastructure of mutual protection that sustained institutional resistance. Claire had seen it before, had navigated its corridors throughout her career. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young candidate, the same one Claire had corrected on the range. Tyler Wilson hesitated by their table, his posture conveying the uncertainty of approaching senior officers during mealtime. Major Hawkins, he said, I wanted to thank you for the shooting correction. The breathing technique made a real difference. Claire assessed him more carefully now. Early 20s, athletic build. Eyes that conveyed intelligence and unusual self-awareness for his age. You're welcome, Candidate Wilson. Proper technique becomes even more crucial under stress conditions. Wilson nodded, then seemed to gather his courage for something more. If I may, ma'am, your demonstration was remarkable. I've never seen shooting that precise from standing position at that distance. Claire offered a minimal smile. Practice, Wilson. Thousands of rounds in all conditions. She paused, then decided to probe slightly. How are you finding the assessment program so far? Challenging, ma'am, as it should be. His eyes flicked briefly toward the table where Reynolds and Kelly were seated, then back to Claire. The instructors are thorough. The careful choice of words told Claire more than a direct complaint would have. Wilson was observant and diplomatic, valuable qualities in a special operations environment. Thoroughness builds readiness, she replied, giving him the expected response while studying his reaction. Yes, ma'am. Wilson hesitated again, then added, though sometimes the standards seem to shift depending on who's being evaluated. The statement was bold, bordering on criticism of superior officers. Claire kept her expression neutral, but her assessment of Wilson adjusted upward. He had moral courage alongside physical capability. Standards should be consistent. Candidate, that's the purpose of my evaluation. She nodded slightly, dismissing him without reprimand. Good luck with the afternoon drills. After Wilson departed, Mitchell leaned forward. He's their top performer, but still catches the most criticism. Reynolds rides him constantly. Wyatt Wilson questioned one of Kelly's tactical decisions during a field exercise. Respectfully but publicly, they've been harder on him since. Claire made a mental note. Reynolds and Kelly valued conformity alongside competence, a common trait in traditional military structures, but potentially problematic in special operations environments, where adaptive thinking was often the difference between success and catastrophe. Across the mess hall, Reynolds was watching their interaction with Wilson, his expression unreadable. When he caught Claire's eye, he didn't look away, a silent acknowledgement that lines were being drawn. The afternoon sun beat down on the tactical training area, transforming the field into a crucible of heat and exertion. Claire had changed into full combat gear plate, carrier tactical belt, knee pads to better evaluate the transition drills from a participant's perspective. The weight of the equipment was familiar, a second skin she had worn across 3 continents. Reynolds had arranged the drill stations with professional precision barricade firing positions, cover-to-cover movement lanes, target discrimination scenarios. Despite her initial impressions, Claire had to acknowledge his technical competence. The layout was challenging without being unnecessarily punitive. Candidates will rotate through all stations, Reynolds explained to the assembled group. Each station simulates a different tactical environment, requiring transition from primary to secondary weapons under stress conditions. Claire nodded her approval. I'll be running the course alongside the candidates to evaluate flow and design. Reynolds' expression flickered with surprise, quickly masked. The course is designed for candidates under evaluation major, not visiting officers. Consider me temporarily under evaluation then, Sergeant, Claire replied, checking the training Glock in her holster. I prefer hands-on assessment. The drill began with methodical intensity. Candidates moved through the course engaging targets, transitioning between weapons. When primary systems were designated as failed, navigating obstacles while maintaining tactical awareness. Claire followed the same sequence, her movements precise and economical, the physical expression of lessons learned through years of operational experience. From his observation position, Reynolds watched her with growing confusion. Her performance contradicted his expectations. Each movement, each weapon, transition, each target engagement reflected the muscle memory of someone who had executed these skills under actual fire, not just training conditions. His eyes narrowed as she cleared a complex room entry scenario with textbook perfection, her breathing controlled even after the physical exertion. When Claire completed the final station, Reynolds approached professional respect, now visibly wrestling with his preconceptions. Impressive performance, Major, he said, the words emerging as if extracted under duress. The course design is excellent, Claire replied, returning her training weapons to the rack. Realistic pressure points, good scenario progression. Reynolds seemed momentarily disarmed by the genuine compliment. Thank you, ma'am. Claire used the opening to probe further. I'm particularly interested in your SEER component. I understand you'll be running that evaluation next week. Yes, ma'am. 72 hours in the Ohari Mountains. Limited equipment, evasion scenarios, resistance training. I'd like to review the full protocol before then. Something hardened in Reynolds' expression. Of course, though the scenarios change for each cohort to prevent preparation advantages. Claire held his gaze. Adaptability is crucial for special operations, for candidates and instructors alike. Before Reynolds could respond, their attention was diverted by a commotion at one of the drill stations. Candidate Wilson was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Sergeant Kelly. Though they couldn't hear the exchange, the body language was unmistakable disagreement verging on confrontation. Claire and Reynolds moved toward the situation simultaneously. As they approached, Kelly's voice became audible. Not here to debate tactics, candidate. You follow the protocol as established. Wilson stood his ground, though his posture remained respectful. With respect, Sergeant, the protocol creates unnecessary exposure during the room transition. The manual specifically recommends maintaining cover during. The manual is a guideline, not gospel, Kelly snapped. In the field, you'll follow your team leader's instructions without amateur analysis. Claire assessed the training station, a room-clearing scenario with multiple entry points and target arrays. Wilson's critique wasn't immediately apparent to the untrained eye, but she quickly spotted the tactical issue. He'd identified a mandatory exposure point during transition that violated basic CQB principles. "What's the situation here?" Reynolds asked, his tone making it clear he expected the issue to be the candidate's deficiency, not the course design. Before Kelly could answer, Claire spoke. "Candidate Wilson has identified a legitimate safety concern with the station layout." She turned to Wilson. "Explain your observation." Wilson straightened, his voice steady despite the tension. "The protocol requires transitioning between rooms through this central point, sir. It creates a fatal funnel with no cover options and exposure to two potential threat areas simultaneously." Reynolds frowned, examining the layout more carefully. Claire could see the moment he recognized the flaw, a slight shift in his expression from dismissal to reluctant reconsideration. "Standard procedure would maintain wall contact and clear sequentially," Wilson continued, "rather than crossing the open space as the current protocol requires." Kelly's jaw tightened. "The point of the exercise is to test decision-making under imperfect conditions." "The point," Claire countered, "is to instill proper tactical habits that translate to survival in actual combat." She turned to Reynolds, curious how he would handle the situation. "Your assessment, Sergeant." Reynolds was trapped between defending his colleague and acknowledging a legitimate safety concern. His hesitation was brief but noticeable. "The candidate's observation has merit," he said finally, the admission clearly difficult. "We'll adjust the protocol for the remaining rotations." Claire nodded, then addressed Wilson. "Good tactical awareness, candidate. Operational safety supersedes hierarchy when lives are at stake." She turned back to Reynolds and Kelly. "That principle applies at all levels of command, gentlemen." The message beneath her words was clear. She had identified the first crack in their system and exploited it to establish her authority. It wasn't about Wilson's observation, it was about the instructor's resistance to legitimate criticism from those they considered beneath them. As Claire walked away, she could feel Reynolds' eyes on her back. The afternoon's events had shifted something fundamental in their dynamic. He no longer saw her as merely a political appointment or an administrative obstacle. Now he saw her as a threat to his authority, to his system, perhaps even to his worldview. Back in her quarters later that evening, Claire methodically cleaned her sidearm, the routine maintenance allowing her mind to process the day's observations. Her preliminary assessment was taking shape. Reynolds and Kelly weren't just resistant to female integration. They were resistant to any change that threatened their control over the assessment process. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Claire reassembled the pistol with practiced movements before answering. Tyler Wilson stood in the hallway, his expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "May I speak with you, Major, privately?" Claire studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to allow him entry. She closed the door but remained standing, maintaining professional distance. "This is irregular, Candidate Wilson." "I know, ma'am." He stood at parade rest, eyes fixed slightly above her head in proper military fashion. "But I believe you should know something about the upcoming SEER evaluation." Claire remained silent, waiting. Wilson took a deep breath. "I overheard Sergeants Reynolds and Kelly discussing modifications to the evaluation parameters, specifically for your observation group." "What kind of modifications?" "They plan to alter the navigation coordinates and safety protocols." Wilson's voice remained steady, but tension showed in his shoulders. "They mentioned ensuring that certain candidates would face enhanced challenges." "You're making serious allegations against superior officers, Wilson." "Yes, ma'am, I am." His eyes met hers directly now. "Because I joined the Army to serve honorably. What they're planning violates that principle." Claire considered the young man before her. Coming forward carried significant risk to his career, especially if Reynolds discovered his disclosure. "Why tell me this? Why not report through standard channels?" "With respect, ma'am, I think you know why." Wilson's expression hardened slightly. "Standard channels haven't been particularly responsive to certain types of complaints." Claire nodded once acknowledgement without explicit agreement. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, candidate. I'll handle it appropriately." After Wilson left, Claire sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She began typing a detailed report of the day's observations, encrypted for transmission to her actual commanding officer, not Blackwood, but a deputy director at the Pentagon whose interest in the integration program went beyond public relations. The last line of her report was the most significant: confirmed suspicion of deliberate assessment manipulation targeting specific candidate profiles. Will proceed with phase 2 of evaluation to gather conclusive evidence. She encrypted the file, sent it through secure channels, then deleted all traces from her local drive. Tomorrow would require a different approach. Reynolds had revealed his professional competence today, but also his vulnerabilities. Claire checked her watch, nearly midnight. She had one more visit to make before sleep. Sullivan was still awake when she arrived at his quarters, as if he'd been expecting her. They sat on his small porch overlooking the darkened parade ground, the nighttime sounds of the base, a familiar symphony of distant generators and occasional radio chatter. "They're planning to sabotage the SEER evaluation," Claire said without preamble. Sullivan didn't seem surprised. "For specific candidates. And for me." He nodded slowly, processing this confirmation of his earlier warnings. "You have proof." "Not yet, but I will." The night air carried the scent of pine and the peculiar metallic tang that seemed embedded in military installations worldwide. Neither spoke for several minutes, two veterans comfortable with silence and its uses. Finally, Sullivan turned to her, his face half illuminated by the security lights from the distant perimeter. "What's your play?" "Let them think they're succeeding," Claire replied. "Document everything, then use their own tactics against them." Sullivan smiled slightly, the expression more predatory than amused. "Just like Mogadishu." "Just like Mogadishu," Claire agreed. The reference hung between them, a shared memory of an operation where everything had gone wrong, but where adaptation and counterintelligence had ultimately saved lives. Claire had learned her most valuable lesson there, where sometimes the best weapon wasn't a rifle or even direct confrontation. Sometimes it was simply letting your opponent believe they were winning until the moment their victory became their undoing. As she left Sullivan's quarters and walked back through the sleeping base, Claire's resolve hardened into something beyond professional duty. This wasn't just about program evaluation or integration policies. It was about the fundamental principle that had guided her through 2 decades of service. The battlefield didn't care about gender, race, or politics. It only cared about capability, courage, and the willingness to adapt. Reynolds and his allies were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The preparations for the SERI evaluation unfolded with the precision of a military operation. In the pre-dawn darkness, 3 days after Wilson's warning, Claire moved through her quarters with practiced efficiency, assembling her gear with the methodical attention of someone who understood that survival often hinged on the smallest details. Each item she placed in her rucksack had been selected with purpose. A military-grade compass whose luminous dial had guided her through mountains in Afghanistan, a LifeStraw water filter that had proven its worth during extended operations in terrain where clean water was scarcer than reliable intelligence, her K-bar tactical knife worn smooth at the grip from years of field use. The weight of the pack against her shoulders was familiar, a soldier's burden, literal and figurative. As she secured the straps, Claire's thoughts turned to the intelligence she'd gathered since Wilson's revelation. Through careful observation and strategic conversations with base personnel, she had confirmed the young candidates warning Reynolds and Kelly had indeed modified the standard SEER protocols, creating a course designed to push certain candidates, particularly the female trainees, and Wilson himself, beyond reasonable limits. What they didn't know was that Claire had spent the intervening days conducting her own modifications, not to the course itself, but to her preparation for it. She had memorized the original maps and GPS coordinates, studied weather patterns for the Uwari Mountains in this season, and most importantly, planted her own surveillance assets along key points of the route. A knock at her door announced Lieutenant Mitchell's arrival. "Transport leaves in 15, ma'am," Mitchell said, her own pack already secured. Claire nodded. "Ready." They walked through the silent base toward the assembly area where 3 canvas-covered trucks idled in the cool morning air, their exhaust creating ghostly columns in the pre-dawn light. Candidates and instructors gathered in small clusters, checking equipment and exchanging the particular brand of gallows humor that preceded challenging military exercises. Reynolds stood at the center of the staging area, clipboard in hand, his face illuminated by a tactical flashlight as he checked names against his roster. His eyes narrowed slightly when Claire approached. "Major Hawkins," he said, voice professionally neutral. "You're aware this is a full immersion exercise? No observer accommodations in the field." "I'm familiar with the SEER protocols, Sergeant," Claire replied, shifting her pack to a more comfortable position. "I've been through the school twice." Something flickered across Reynolds' face, surprise perhaps, or recalculation. Very good, ma'am. You'll be in Vehicle 2 with candidates Wilson Ramirez and Chen plus Sergeant Kelly. Claire recognized the assignment for what it was, a strategic placement with the candidates Reynolds considered most likely to fail, supervised by his most loyal ally. She nodded without comment and moved toward the designated truck. As she approached, she noticed Wilson carefully adjusting his rucksack straps. His face showed the focused concentration of a soldier mentally preparing for a challenge. But when he spotted Claire, a moment of recognition passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of shared information. "Mount up," Reynolds called, and the groups moved toward their assigned vehicles. Inside the truck, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the particular brand of tension that preceded military evaluations. Kelly sat opposite Claire, his face impassive in the dim light. Between them, the three candidates maintained professional silence, though Claire noted the subtle indicators of their mental states: Wilson's controlled breathing, Ramirez's repeated equipment. Checked Chen's thousand-yard stare, the universal expression of a soldier visualizing scenarios and responses. The trucks lurched forward, beginning the 2-hour journey to the training area in the Ohari mountain range. As the convoy left the main base and turned onto the highway, Claire closed her eyes not to sleep, but to conserve energy and mental focus. The real challenge wouldn't begin until they reached the mountains, and she had learned long ago that rest was a tactical resource to be managed as carefully as ammunition. The memory of another truck ride surfaced unbidden: Kandahar, 2002. The operation that didn't exist on paper. 8 operators, including herself, moving through Taliban-controlled territory toward a high-value target. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong, not because of enemy action, but because of betrayal from within their own unit. A male teammate who couldn't accept taking orders from a woman in combat had deliberately compromised their position, resulting in an ambush that killed 3 team members. Claire had managed to extract the survivors, completed the mission objective despite the sabotage, and brought out the wounded. But when she reported the deliberate compromise, her accusations were dismissed as stress-induced confusion. The betrayal was buried under classification, her team was dispersed to different commands, and the lessons that should have been learned were instead concealed beneath layers of institutional protection. She opened her eyes, forcing the memories back into their compartment. This time would be different. This time she had prepared for betrayal in advance. The convoy wound its way into the Uwharrie Mountains as dawn broke across the North Carolina wilderness. Ancient granite formations rose from forests of oak, hickory, and pine, a terrain that had challenged military movements since the Revolutionary War. These mountains weren't as imposing as the Hindu Kush or as unforgiving as the Iraqi desert, but they offered their own unique challenges: dense vegetation that limited visibility, sudden weather changes, and enough isolation to create genuine survival conditions. The truck stopped at a clearing that served as the insertion point. Reynolds emerged from the lead vehicle and addressed the assembled group, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a senior non-commissioned officer accustomed to outdoor briefings. "This is a 72-hour SEER evaluation in 3 phases, he said, scanning the faces before him. Phase 1, evasion. You'll navigate to 3 checkpoints while avoiding capture by the opposition force. Phase 2, survival. You'll establish shelter, procure water, and survive in field conditions with minimal equipment. Phase 3, resistance. If captured, you'll demonstrate proper conduct under simulated hostile interrogation." He paused, letting the information settle. "Each of you has a GPS unit map, compass, basic survival kit, and emergency beacon. The beacons are for genuine emergencies only. Activating one without justification results in immediate failure." Claire noted the subtle emphasis on the word failure, the slight shift in Reynolds' tone when his gaze passed over the female candidates and Wilson. The message was clear to anyone with ears trained to hear it: some of them were expected to fail. "Major Hawkins will be evaluating the course design and implementation," Reynolds continued. "She will move independently through the area. Treat her as you would any other senior officer encountered during operations." Claire caught the carefully crafted ambiguity in his instructions. In a SEER exercise, senior officers encountered in the field could be friendly resources or part of the opposition force designed to confuse candidates. Reynolds was deliberately leaving her role uncertain. "Questions?" Reynolds asked, his tone suggesting none were expected. When no one spoke, he nodded once. "You have your starting coordinates. First checkpoint must be reached by 1800 hours. Disperse. The candidates moved out with the deliberate urgency of soldiers on mission, each taking slightly different routes into the forest. Claire waited, watching Reynolds and Kelly exchange a brief look before Kelly moved to follow the group Claire had traveled with. She noted the direction he took, then turned to Sullivan, who had arrived separately and now stood at the edge of the clearing. "They've modified the course since the briefing documents," Sullivan said quietly as she approached. "New checkpoint locations, different opposition force patterns." "As expected," Claire replied, checking her GPS against her map. "The real question is, what else they've changed?" Sullivan's weathered face creased with concern. "I've got a bad feeling about this one, Claire. Weather Service issued an advisory storm front moving in faster than predicted. Could hit by late afternoon." Claire studied the western horizon where distant clouds were gathering against the mountains. "Not yet threatening, but weather in these ranges could change with dangerous speed." "Perfect cover for training accidents," she said. "All the more reason to stick to the plan." Sullivan handed her a small device no larger than a cigarette lighter. "Emergency transponder. Military grade, not standard issue. If things go sideways, this connects directly to my receiver." Claire pocketed the device. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Sullivan's eyes, faded blue, but still sharp, held hers for a moment. "Watch your six out there. Some men would rather break the system than see it change." With a nod of acknowledgement, Claire shouldered her pack and moved into the forest, choosing a route that would intersect with Wilson's group within the hour. As she navigated through the dense underbrush, her senses expanded to encompass the environment around her. The direction of the wind, the movement patterns of local wildlife, the subtle indicators of human passage through wilderness. This was the domain where she had always excelled, not the political battlefields of Pentagon conference rooms or the abstract terrain of policy debates, but the actual field where theory met practice, where competence couldn't be faked, and where the consequences of failure were immediate and often permanent. By mid-morning, the force had transformed from a navigational challenge to an ally. Claire moved through it with the confidence of someone who had learned to read wilderness terrain as clearly as others read text. She had already located 2 of the modified checkpoints, confirmed the position of one opposition force team using trail signs visible only to experienced operators, and was now tracking Wilson's group from a distance that kept her presence unknown. The clouds building in the western sky had multiplied and darkened their undersides, now the ominous gray of imminent precipitation. The wind had shifted, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain and dropping the temperature several degrees in the past hour. Claire estimated the storm would hit within 3 to 4 hours, well before nightfall, and potentially before most candidates reached their first checkpoint. She paused at the crest of a small rise, using a compact binocular to scan the valley below. Wilson's 3-person team was moving with reasonable efficiency, maintaining proper intervals and communication protocols. More interesting was Kelly's position, not with the candidates as a traditional evaluator would be, but parallel to them, almost as if herding them toward a specific route. Claire checked her map against known checkpoint locations and then studied the terrain ahead. Kelly was directing them away from the most efficient route toward a section of the valley marked by steeper slopes and a stream crossing. In normal conditions, this would simply be a more challenging path, a test of the candidate's physical endurance and navigational skills. But with a storm approaching, that stream could become a legitimate hazard. She took a different route down the slope, moving to intercept the group before they reached the stream. As she navigated a particularly dense section of underbrush, a faint sound caught her attention: the click of a radio transmission from somewhere to her right. Claire froze, controlling her breathing as she scanned the area. 30 meters away, partially concealed behind a fallen oak, a figure in camouflage was monitoring Wilson's group through binoculars. The observer's position and equipment didn't match standard opposition force protocols. This wasn't part of the official exercise. Claire circled wide, approaching from the observer's blind side. Years of covert operations had taught her to move silently through terrain that would betray most soldiers with snapping twigs or rustling leaves. She closed the distance methodically, identifying the observer as one of Reynolds' junior instructors, Staff Sergeant Cooper, a former Ranger with a reputation for unquestioning loyalty to his superiors. She was close enough to hear his radio transmission. "Group Alpha approaching Waypoint Delta, ETA 15 minutes. The response came through clearly. Roger, diversion in place, maintain position. Claire committed the exchange to memory, then retreated without alerting Cooper to her presence. The diversion almost certainly referred to something at the stream crossing. She needed to reach Wilson's group before they encountered it. Moving at a controlled but urgent pace, Claire navigated through the forest, paralleling Wilson's route, but gaining ground due to her more efficient path. The weather was deteriorating more quickly now, the wind pushing against the trees with increasing force, creating a constant susurration of leaves and branches that provided useful audio cover for her movement. She intercepted the group approximately 200 meters before the stream crossing, stepping onto the trail directly in front of them. Wilson reacted first, his hand instinctively moving toward his training weapon before recognition registered. "Major Hawkins," he said, recovering smoothly. "At ease." Claire replied, her tone casual but her posture conveying urgency. "Taking a direct interest in your navigation progress." Kelly emerged from the brush behind them, his expression darkening when he spotted Claire. "Major, this is an independent evaluation phase. Candidate interaction with staff is restricted to designated checkpoints." "I'm not Staff Sergeant. I'm conducting a course evaluation which requires direct observation of candidate performance under various conditions." Claire turned back to the candidates. "Your next checkpoint approach crosses that stream." "Yes, ma'am," Wilson answered. "GPS coordinates indicate we continue along this bearing for another half-kilometer cross at the marked ford, then proceed northwest to checkpoint Alpha." Claire nodded, studying the sky. "Weather's shifting faster than forecast. That stream feeds from higher elevations. Flash flood potential will increase significantly with the rainfall." Kelly stepped forward. "With respect, major assessment of environmental conditions is part of the evaluation. The candidates need to make their own risk calculations." "Of course," Claire agreed smoothly. "I'm simply providing the environmental intelligence that would be available to an operational team. Proper risk assessment requires complete information." She turned back to the candidates. "Standard protocol with potential flash flood conditions is to identify alternate crossing points or delay water crossing until conditions stabilize. Your assessment." Wilson glanced at his teammates, then at his map. "There's another crossing point half a kilometer downstream. Longer route, but lower elevation and wider stream bed. Less flash flood risk." "Concur," Chen added, studying her compass. "We'd still make the checkpoint deadline if we adjust course now." Kelly's jaw tightened. "The designated route is a guideline," Claire interrupted, echoing Kelly's own words from the training range incident. "Real operators adapt to changing conditions. Sergeant, that's what we're evaluating, their ability to make sound tactical decisions, not their ability to follow a line on a map." The tension between them was palpable, but Kelly was trapped by his own training doctrine. To insist on the original route now would contradict the very principles of adaptive decision-making that special operations selection was designed to identify. "Your call, candidates," he said finally. Wilson looked at his teammates, received confirming nods, then turned to Claire. "We're adjusting course to the alternate crossing, ma'am." "Carry on," Claire replied, stepping aside to let them pass. As the group moved off along their new route, Kelly lingered, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality that didn't quite conceal the anger beneath. "Interesting timing, your appearance," he said, voice low enough that the candidates couldn't hear. "I've always found that good intelligence often appears just when it's most needed," Claire replied, "a lesson from the field that applies across all operational environments." She held his gaze, the unspoken message clear. She knew about the diversion, and she had countered it. Without waiting for his response, she turned and moved back into the forest, disappearing among the trees before Kelly could formulate a reply. The encounter had accomplished multiple objectives. She had protected the candidates from whatever hazard had been arranged at the original crossing, demonstrated her awareness of the manipulations without directly confronting them, and forced Kelly into a position where he had to allow the change of plans or reveal his true intentions. But it was only the first move in what promised to be a complex game. Reynolds and his allies would adapt their strategy now that she had shown her hand. The real question was what they would do next, and whether the approaching storm would factor into their revised plans. The weather deteriorated with alarming speed over the next 2 hours. What had begun as distant clouds transformed into a rolling front of thunderheads that swallowed the afternoon sun, plunging the forest into premature twilight. The wind strengthened to a constant force that bent smaller trees and sent dead branches crashing to the forest floor. When the rain finally began, it arrived not as a gradual increase, but as an immediate deluge. Sheets of water driven horizontally by the wind, reducing visibility to mere meters and transforming every depression in the ground into a growing puddle. Claire had positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the second checkpoint, a small clearing marked by a distinctive lightning-struck oak. Through rain-blurred vision, she could see four instructors huddled under a hastily erected tarp, their body language conveying growing concern about the deteriorating conditions. Several candidate groups had already reached the checkpoint and been processed through, but Wilson's team was not among them. Her tactical instincts, honed through years of operations where environmental conditions often presented greater threats than human enemies, sent warning signals through her consciousness. This was no longer a training scenario with manufactured challenges. The storm had introduced genuine danger into the equation, the kind that could transform a controlled exercise into a survival situation with life or death consequences. Claire keyed her emergency radio, bypassing the exercise frequencies to access the base command channel. Static filled her earpiece, punctuated by fragments of transmissions distorted by the storm's electrical activity. She adjusted the frequency slightly and tried again. Sierra Actual, this is November 6. Weather conditions have deteriorated beyond exercise parameters. Recommend immediate suspension of field operations. Over. The response came through broken but intelligible. November 6. This is Sierra Actual. Weather advisory upgraded to severe thunderstorm warning. Lightning strikes reported throughout the area. Exercise suspended. Recall all personnel to designated emergency assembly points. Acknowledge. Sierra Actual November 6 acknowledges. Proceeding to emergency assembly point Echo. Be advised I am tracking missing candidate team. Will report when located. Claire checked her GPS against the map, confirming the location of assembly point Echo, a ranger station at the southeastern edge of the training area. But her immediate concern was Wilson's team. Their alternate route should have brought them to the checkpoint well before the storm's peak intensity. Their absence suggested they had encountered problems. Moving down from her observation position, Claire approached the instructor group at the checkpoint. The driving rain had soaked through her uniform within minutes, plastering fabric against skin and adding kilos of water weight to her already substantial gear. The senior instructor, a staff sergeant named Martinez, recognized her immediately. Major Hawkins' exercise has been suspended. We're evacuating to the ranger station. Wilson's team, Claire asked, raising her voice above the wind and rain. Martinez shook his head. Haven't seen them. Last radio contact placed them approximately 2 kilometers southwest, moving toward the alternate stream crossing. Sergeant Kelly. Called in 10 minutes ago, already moving to the assembly point. The information confirmed Claire's suspicions. Kelly had separated from the candidate team, leaving them to navigate the increasingly hazardous conditions alone. It could be justified as part of the evaluation under normal circumstances, but with the exercise officially suspended, his failure to ensure his candidate's safety represented a serious breach of protocol. I'm going after them, Claire said. Send a message to Colonel Sullivan at base. Tell him I'm tracking Team Alpha to the alternate crossing point. Martinez's expression conveyed professional concern. With respect, ma'am, conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Command ordered all personnel to the assembly point. 3 candidates are unaccounted for in life-threatening conditions, Sergeant. That supersedes standard evacuation protocols. Claire checked her compass. I'll bring them in. Before Martinez could object further, she turned and moved back into the forest orientation, now more challenging, with visibility reduced to meters and landmarks obscured by the constant curtain of rain. But Claire had operated in conditions far worse than this: midnight infiltrations through mountain passes in Afghanistan, sandstorms in Iraq that stripped paint from vehicles and flesh from exposed skin. This storm was dangerous but navigable to someone with her training. She pushed southwest using a combination of GPS guidance and terrain reading to maintain her course. The forest floor had transformed into a network of impromptu streams, water flowing downhill with increasing volume and force. Twice, she had to divert around areas where rising water made passage unsafe. After 20 minutes of difficult progress, Claire paused to reorient. According to her calculations, she should be approaching the alternate stream crossing. But the sound reaching her through the storm wasn't the normal flow of a woodland stream, it was the roar of water moving with destructive force. She pushed forward and through a final screen of vegetation and stopped at the edge of what had been hours earlier a manageable stream crossing. Now it was a churning torrent of muddy water. Its banks overflowed, carrying fallen trees and debris as it thundered through the forest. No candidate team could safely cross here now, which meant Wilson's group was either stranded on the far side or had attempted to find yet another route. Claire scanned the opposite bank, searching for any sign of human presence. Nothing was visible through the rain and gathering darkness. She keyed her radio again. Team Alpha, this is Major Hawkins. Radio check, over. Static answered her. She tried again on the emergency frequency with the same result. Either their radios had failed due to water damage, or the storm was disrupting transmissions beyond usable range. A sound cut through the roar of water and wind, a sharp crack followed by a splintering crash. Claire turned towards the noise in time to see a massive oak, its root system undermined by the saturated ground, topple into the swollen stream approximately 50 meters upstream. The impact sent a surge of water downstream, further eroding the banks. This situation had progressed beyond a training exercise gone awry. It now represented a genuine emergency with potential casualties. Claire needed to locate the missing team quickly. She followed the stream's edge upstream, reasoning that if Wilson's team had found the crossing impassable, they would have moved to higher ground following standard survival protocols. The going was treacherous, mud sucked at her boots, with each step concealing roots and rocks that threatened ankles and knees with every misplaced foot. 10 minutes later, her persistence was rewarded. On a small rise approximately 30 meters from the stream, a flash of color caught her eye, the distinctive shade of a standard-issue rain poncho partially visible behind a cluster of boulders. Claire altered course, moving toward the potential shelter. As she approached, voices became audible above the storm, tense, urgent, but controlled. Good sign. Panic was the true enemy in survival situations, and its absence suggested the team was maintaining their training discipline despite the deteriorating conditions. Team Alpha, she called as she drew near, identifying herself before her sudden appearance triggered defensive reactions. Wilson emerged from behind the boulders, rain streaming from his poncho hood. Relief flashed across his face. Major Hawkins, Claire joined them in their makeshift shelter, a natural formation of boulders that provided minimal protection from the horizontal rain. Chen and Ramirez were huddled against the largest rock, both soaked through but alert and responsive. Chen was applying a field dressing to Ramirez's leg, where a torn pant leg revealed a laceration approximately 6 inches long. Situation report, Claire said, crouching to examine Ramirez's injury. Stream was already flooding when we arrived, Wilson explained. We attempted to locate another crossing point upstream, but conditions deteriorated too quickly. During our withdrawal to higher ground, candidate Ramirez was injured by a falling branch. We established this shelter and have been attempting to radio for assistance. All frequencies are compromised by storm interference. Claire nodded, assessing Ramirez's wound. The cut was deep, but had missed major blood vessels. Field treatment was appropriate for now, but the injury would severely hamper movement through the difficult terrain. Exercise has been suspended, she informed them. All personnel ordered to emergency assembly points. Nearest is Echo, the ranger station, approximately 3 kilometers southeast of our position. Chen looked up from her medical work. Ramirez can't move quickly with this injury. The terrain between here and the ranger station includes 2 water crossings in a steep ravine based on our maps. Understood, Claire replied. She considered their options, weighing risk factors against the declining environmental conditions. We establish overnight position here. Improve shelter signal fire if conditions permit, medical monitoring for Ramirez. Attempt evacuation at first light or when storm abates. Wilson frowned. Shouldn't we try to reach the assembly point? They'll have medical facilities. Negative, Claire said firmly. Movement through unfamiliar terrain in darkness during severe weather with an injured team member creates unacceptable risk levels. The priority now is stabilizing our position and ensuring no further injuries occur. She noted the doubt in Wilson's expression, not insubordination, but the natural concern of a soldier who believed movement toward friendly resources was the correct protocol. It was the same instinct that had gotten countless troops killed in survival situations where patience would have saved them. This isn't a test, Wilson, she added, her voice softer but no less authoritative. This is real-world survival application. Sometimes the correct tactical decision is to hold position when conditions guarantee that movement will create more casualties. Understanding registered in his eyes. He nodded once, shifting immediately to implementation mode. We'll need to improve the shelter. These rocks provide minimal protection from wind and rain. Agreed, we have approximately 90 minutes of daylight remaining. Priority task, shelter improvement, water management, injury care communication attempt. Claire removed her pack, extracting a small case of medical supplies more advanced than the standard field kit. I'll take first watch on Ramirez. You and Chen gather materials to reinforce the shelter. As Wilson and Chen moved out to collect branches and foliage, Claire turned her attention to Ramirez's injury. The field dressing was professionally applied but needed reinforcement for an overnight situation. She removed the soaked bandage, cleaned the wound area with antiseptic from her kit, applied a hemostatic agent to control bleeding, then covered it with a waterproof trauma dressing. That should hold, she said, securing the final tape. How's your pain level? Ramirez managed a tight smile. 3 out of 10, ma'am. I've had worse playing football. Claire appreciated the attempt at humor, another good sign that morale remained intact. Let me know if it increases. I have pain management options if needed. She checked her watch, 17:20 hours. The storm showed no signs of abating, its intensity possibly increasing as the main front moved through the area. This would be a long night with genuine risks. But the candidates were responding well, maintaining discipline and focus despite the shift from training scenario to actual emergency. Claire extracted her emergency transponder, the one Sullivan had provided. Its military-grade signal could potentially cut through the storm interference where standard radios failed. She activated it, sending a pre-coded message indicating their position and status. Whether the signal would reach through the atmospheric disturbance remained uncertain, but it represented their best chance of communication until conditions improved. Wilson and Chen returned with armfuls of branches and pine boughs, immediately setting to work, creating a lean-to structure against the largest boulder. Claire joined them, her experienced hands quickly turning random materials into a functional shelter. Within 30 minutes, they had constructed a space that, while far from comfortable, would provide critical protection from the elements through the night. As darkness settled over the forest, transforming the storm from visual threat to auditory menace, the four of them huddled in the confined shelter space. Claire distributed emergency ration bars from her pack, not for taste, but for the calories and psychological comfort that came from shared sustenance in adverse conditions. Will they search for us tonight? Chen asked a question directed at Claire. No, she answered honestly. Night search in these conditions would endanger more personnel without significantly improving our chances. They'll establish search patterns at first light, assuming the storm has diminished. Wilson studied her face in the dim light of their single chemical glow stick. You've been in situations like this before. It wasn't a question, but Claire treated it as one. Afghanistan 2008, extraction gone wrong, 3-day hold in mountain terrain with injured personnel and hostile forces in the area. She didn't elaborate further. Some experiences couldn't be translated into training scenarios or casual conversation. How did it end? Ramirez asked. Claire's expression remained neutral, but her eyes carried the weight of memory. We all came home. That's the only metric that matters in situations like this. The answer seemed to satisfy them. The conversation lulled, replaced by the constant percussion of rain against their makeshift shelter and the deep bass rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains. Despite the noise, fatigue soon claimed the candidates, the day's physical exertion, stress, and exposure combining to overwhelm even trained resistance to sleep. Claire maintained watch, monitoring Ramirez's condition and scanning their surroundings at regular intervals. The transponder sat beside her, its small indicator, light blinking steadily, confirmation that it was still transmitting their position to whoever might be listening. As midnight approached, a new sound penetrated the storm's constant roar, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors, distant but approaching. Claire moved to the shelter entrance, straining to locate the aircraft through the darkness and rain. No visual contact was possible, but the sound pattern was unmistakable. A Black Hawk flying search pattern, its pilot taking significant risks to operate in such conditions. She extracted a signal flare from her vest, not standard issue for the exercise, but part of her personal kit that she never entered field conditions without. If the helicopter came within visual range, the flare would cut through the darkness and rain to mark their position. The rotor sound grew louder, then diminished, then returned, the helicopter sweeping the area in expanding grid patterns. Claire waited, conserving the single flare until maximum effect was possible. On the third pass, the sound peaked directly overhead, close enough that the downdraft momentarily disturbed the rain pattern above their shelter. Claire stepped out into the full force of the storm, aimed the flare at a 45-degree angle away from the shelter, and fired. The magnesium compound ignited with blinding intensity, cutting through rain and darkness like a miniature sun. For 3 critical seconds, their position was illuminated with unmistakable clarity before the flare arced away and extinguished in the saturated forest. The helicopter's reaction was immediate, a change in engine pitch as it banked sharply toward their position. Moments later, a powerful spotlight cut through the rain, sweeping the area until it fixed on their shelter and Claire's upraised arm. The Blackhawk couldn't land in the dense forest, but it didn't need to. As Claire watched a figure repelled from the hovering aircraft, a rescue specialist, his descent controlled and precise despite the treacherous conditions. Behind her, Wilson emerged from the shelter, awakened by the aircraft noise. "Extraction?" he asked, raising his voice above the combined roar of storm and rotors. Claire nodded. "Get the others ready to move. Ramirez will need a stretcher lift." As Wilson returned to prepare his teammates, Claire moved toward the descending rescuer, recognizing the silhouette even before his boots touched ground. Colonel Frank Sullivan, in full weather gear and tactical harness, disconnected from the rappel line and moved toward her with the sure-footed confidence of an operator whose age had done nothing to diminish his fieldcraft. "Thought you could use a hand," he shouted above the noise, his weathered face splitting into a brief grin. "Transponder signal came through about an hour ago." Claire felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the extraction, but for the simple fact that in a military culture where paperwork often superseded initiative, Sullivan had chosen direct action over protocol. "We have one injured," she replied, leading him toward the shelter. "Leg laceration stable, but mobility impaired." Sullivan nodded, already assessing the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted countless field extractions. "Bird can take 2 at a time, injured first, then the others." He glanced at the sky. "We've got a break in the worst of the storm. Need to move before it closes again." The extraction proceeded with the efficient precision that characterized military rescue operations at their best. Ramirez was secured in a rescue basket and hoisted to the hovering Blackhawk, with Chen accompanying him. 20 minutes later, the helicopter returned for Wilson and Claire, with Sullivan remaining on the ground to coordinate with the ground search teams that would arrive at first light. As Claire secured herself to the extraction line, Sullivan gripped her arm, his expression suddenly serious. Reynolds radioed in that all his personnel were accounted for, never reported the missing candidates. The information confirmed what Claire had already suspected, that the training exercise had evolved into something far more disturbing. Reynolds had deliberately abandoned candidates in life-threatening conditions, presumably to eliminate those he deemed unfit, or more specifically to undermine the integration program Claire was evaluating. "Documented?" she asked, the single word carrying multiple layers of meaning. Sullivan nodded, understanding perfectly. "Every transmission, every check-in, every discrepancy. It's all in the operational log." Claire felt a cold certainty settle in her core, not anger, but the focused resolution of someone who had identified a threat and determined its elimination parameters. Reynolds had crossed the line from institutional resistance to endangering lives. Whatever his motivations, whatever his beliefs about who belonged in elite units, he had violated the most fundamental tenet of military leadership, the responsibility for those under his command. As the extraction line pulled taut and lifted her toward the hovering Blackhawk, Claire's mind was already processing the implications of Sullivan's information. Reynolds wouldn't simply face administrative consequences. He would answer for actions that in a combat zone would constitute criminal negligence or worse. The storm continued to rage across the mountains, but its fury was now directed at a landscape empty of human targets. Above it, the Blackhawk banked toward the distant lights of Fort Bragg, carrying 4 survivors whose experience had transformed from training exercise to real-world demonstration of the principles. Such training was designed to instill adaptability, courage, and the unbreakable bond between those who face death together, regardless of gender background or preconceptions. And in that helicopter, watching the storm recede beneath them, Major Claire Hawkins began planning the final phase of an evaluation that had become far more consequential than anyone had anticipated, the phase that would determine not just the future of the integration program, but the careers and possibly the freedom of those who had turned a military training environment into a battlefield of their own making. The medical wing of Fort Bragg's main complex maintained the same sterile efficiency as military hospitals worldwide, an environment where human vulnerability met institutional precision. Morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting geometric patterns across the polished floor of the recovery ward where candidate Ramirez lay with his injured leg properly dressed and elevated. 2 beds down, Chen slept soundly, her exhaustion finally claiming victory over her soldier's vigilance. Claire stood in the doorway, her uniform now dry, and pressed the only evidence of the previous night's ordeal, a small butterfly bandage at her temple where a falling branch had caught her during the extraction. She watched the steady rise and fall of the candidate's breathing, feeling the particular responsibility that came from having brought people safely through danger, not the abstract command responsibility of officers who issued orders from secure positions, but the visceral, immediate accountability of those who led from the front. Doc says they'll both make full recoveries, a voice said from behind her. Major General Blackwood approached with the measured stride of a senior officer making hospital rounds. Ramirez's laceration required 20 stitches, but missed anything critical. Chen showing mild hypothermia symptoms, but nothing serious. Claire nodded. And Wilson, treated and released to quarters this morning, no significant injuries. Blackwood's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes held a question. Your after-action report mentions several irregularities in the SARE exercise implementation. That's one word for it, Claire replied, her tone carefully modulated. I've submitted a full briefing document to your office and the Pentagon Oversight Committee. Blackwood studied her face. Walk with me, Major. They moved down the corridor in silence, passing through security doors to an administrative section where their bootsteps echoed against tile floors polished to a mirror shine. Blackwood led her to a small conference room, secured the door, and gestured for her to sit. I've received a preliminary report from Colonel Sullivan, he said, taking a seat across from her, along with the complete communications log from yesterday's operation. He placed a folder on the table between them. Reynolds radioed confirmation that all personnel were accounted for at 17:05 hours. At that time, 3 candidates and yourself were still in the field in life-threatening conditions. Correct, sir. He falsified a safety report during active military operations. Yes, sir. Blackwood's jaw tightened, the only visible indication of the anger Claire sensed beneath his professional composure. This goes beyond training protocol violations. This borders on criminal negligence. It crossed that border when he deliberately directed candidates into hazardous conditions, then abandoned them when the situation deteriorated. Claire said, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't poor judgment, sir. It was deliberate endangerment. The general studied her for a long moment. You came here to evaluate our integration program. Instead, you've uncovered what appears to be systematic sabotage of that program. He leaned forward slightly. What I need to know, Major, is how deep this goes. Is Reynolds an isolated problem or symptomatic of broader institutional resistance? Claire chose her next words, carefully aware that this conversation had implications far beyond the careers of a few individuals. Reynolds has allies at multiple levels, sir. Personnel files indicate patterns of female candidates being washed out under questionable circumstances. Performance evaluations modified after submission. Complaint investigations conducted by officers with direct personal connections to the subjects of those complaints. You're describing a network, not an individual. I'm describing a culture, sir, one that exists within our broader military culture, but contradicts our core values. Blackwood absorbed this assessment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his internal response. And your recommendation? Complete transparency, Claire replied without hesitation. Full investigation with external oversight. Public consequences for verified violations. That approach could damage the reputation of programs we've spent decades building. With respect, General, those programs are already damaged. The question is whether we repair the foundation or just repaint the exterior. A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or recognition, crossed Blackwood's expression. He tapped the folder with one finger. You've prepared for this conversation. I've had versions of it throughout my career, sir. And the outcomes, Claire's gaze remained stern. Usually cosmetic changes, reassignments rather than accountability. Problem individuals moved rather than removed. Blackwood nodded slowly. That's been the traditional approach. And it's why we're still having this conversation in 2025, sir, decades after women first began serving in combat-adjacent roles. A knock at the door interrupted them. Blackwood called for entry, and a young lieutenant appeared with a tablet in hand. Sir, the JAG representatives have arrived for the initial inquiry. They're assembled in the main conference room. Thank you, Lieutenant. Inform them we'll be there shortly. After the officer departed, Blackwood turned back to Claire. This is your operation now, Major. What's your play? Claire stood adjusting her uniform with a precision born of decades of military discipline. Complete evidence presentation. Recorded testimony from all involved personnel. Recommendation for courts-martial where appropriate. Reynolds has powerful connections at the Pentagon. So do I, sir. For the first time, a hint of steel entered Claire's voice. The difference is, mine don't protect people who endanger their own troops. The Fort Bragg Conference Center had hosted countless mission briefings, strategy sessions, and ceremonial events throughout its history. Today, its main room had been transformed into a quasi-judicial setting with long tables arranged in a U formation and recording equipment positioned to capture testimony from multiple angles. The wall-mounted screens displayed timestamp maps of the training area, weather radar images from the previous day, and communication logs arranged in chronological order. Claire sat at one end of the formation, flanked by two officers from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a stern-faced colonel with salt and pepper hair, and a younger major whose careful note-taking suggested she missed nothing. Across from them, Blackwood occupied a central position, his presence conferring the official gravity of command authority to the proceedings. The room had filled gradually over the past hour. Senior officers from various base departments, medical personnel who had treated the returning candidates, and representatives from the Pentagon's Integration Oversight Committee who had traveled overnight to observe the inquiry. Sullivan sat near the back, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, watching the assemblage with the measured assessment of a veteran who had seen many such gatherings throughout his long career. The doors opened one final time, admitting Master Sergeant Reynolds and Sergeant First Class Kelly. Both men wore freshly pressed uniforms with their full complement of service ribbons and qualification badges, visual reminders of their years of service and accomplishment. Reynolds' face betrayed nothing, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. Kelly appeared less composed, his gaze flickering around the room, assessing faces, calculating support and opposition. Master Sergeant Reynolds, Sergeant First Class Kelly, Blackwood began, his voice carrying the particular weight of a general officer addressing subordinates under inquiry. This is an official Article 32 preliminary hearing to determine whether charges should be referred for court-martial. You are not required to make any statements, and any statements you do make may be used in a subsequent trial by court-martial. Reynolds nodded his understanding, his posture military perfect, despite the circumstances. Understood, sir. Blackwood gestured toward the JAG officers. Colonel Warren will present the preliminary findings. Major Hawkins will provide testimony regarding her direct observations during the incident in question. Colonel Warren stood moving to the central display with the confidence of someone accustomed to presenting legal arguments in high-stakes environments. This inquiry concerns events during the SEER evaluation exercise conducted yesterday in the Ohari Mountain Training Area. Specifically, we are investigating alleged violations of Articles 92, 107, and 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, failure to obey an order or regulation, false official statements, and conduct endangering the welfare of others. The colonel activated the main display, showing a timeline that began with the pre-dawn assembly and ended with a helicopter extraction. The evidence indicates a pattern of deliberate actions designed to create unnecessarily hazardous conditions for specific candidates, followed by abandonment of those candidates when severe weather created life-threatening circumstances. For the next 20 minutes, Warren methodically presented the factual record meteorological data showing the approaching storm had been available before the exercise began. Communications logs revealing that Reynolds and Kelly had modified the course without proper authorization. GPS tracking data confirming that Kelly had deliberately separated from his assigned candidates before the storm reached peak intensity, and the damning radio transmission in which Reynolds falsely reported all personnel accounted for. Throughout the presentation, Reynolds maintained his stoic expression, but Kelly's composure had begun to crack. His fingers drummed silently against his thigh, and a muscle in his jaw twitched visibly when the false safety report was mentioned. Major Hawkins, Warren said, turning toward Claire, please describe your observations during the exercise, beginning with the initial deployment. Claire rose, moving to stand beside the timeline display. Her voice carried the measured cadence of an experienced officer presenting operational information, neither emotional nor mechanical, but precise and authoritative. I observed multiple deviations from standard SERI protocols from the outset. She began highlighting specific points on the timeline. Checkpoint locations were modified from the approved course design without proper documentation. Opposition force positioning created artificial choke points that channeled certain candidates toward hazardous terrain features. Most significantly, Sergeant Kelly's supervision of his assigned candidate team shifted from evaluation to deliberate misdirection. She advanced the display to show the stream crossing location where she had intercepted Wilson's team. When I encountered the team here, they were being directed toward a crossing point that would have become extremely dangerous once the storm intensified. Satellite imagery confirms this crossing point experienced flash flooding within 2 hours of our diversion to the alternate route. Reynolds finally broke his silence. With respect, major challenging environmental conditions are an intentional component of SEER evaluation. Candidates must demonstrate adaptability to changing circumstances. Agreed, Sergeant, Claire replied, her tone neutral. However, there's a critical distinction between challenging conditions and deliberately engineered hazards, particularly when those hazards specifically target certain candidates. She advanced the display again, now showing communication logs with key exchanges highlighted. At 14:45 hours, Base Command issued a severe weather advisory and instructed all field personnel to begin contingency protocols. At 15:32 hours, you acknowledged this advisory. At 17:05 hours, despite having lost communication with 3 candidates and knowing their approximate position relative to rising water levels, you reported all personnel accounted for. The room had gone completely silent, the only sound the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of documentation being reviewed. Claire turned to face Reynolds directly. That false report delayed search and rescue operations by approximately 3 hours. During that time, candidate Ramirez sustained an injury that, under slightly different circumstances, could have been life-threatening due to blood loss and exposure. Reynolds' expression hardened. My report reflected the information available to me at that time. Communications were compromised by storm interference. Yet Sergeant Kelly, who was last with the team, had reported their position to you at 16:30 hours. Claire countered, highlighting the relevant communication log. And your subsequent communications with other field personnel show functional radio transmission capability until at least 17:20 hours. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Reynolds' face, the recognition that the evidence had been assembled with a thoroughness that left little room for conventional denial strategies. Kelly shifted in his seat, glancing toward Reynolds with an expression that suggested mounting concern. Claire noted the dynamic, the first cracks appearing in their unified front. She had seen it before in other investigations, the moment when self-preservation began to outweigh loyalty. Blackwood intervened. Major Hawkins, in your professional assessment, were the actions taken by Sergeant Reynolds and Sergeant Kelly consistent with standard training protocols, or did they constitute deliberate endangerment? The evidence supports only one conclusion, sir. Claire replied, her gaze steady. This was deliberate endangerment motivated by opposition to the integration program I was evaluating. Reynolds' composure finally broke. That's speculation, not evidence. It would be speculation, Claire agreed, except for this. She activated the final display, a transcript of the radio exchange she had overheard between Staff Sergeant Cooper and the unnamed respondent. The highlighted section read clearly, Group Alpha approaching waypoint Delta, ETA 15 minutes. Roger, diversion in place, maintain position. This exchange occurred approximately 30 minutes before I intercepted Wilson's team, Claire explained. The diversion referenced was subsequently confirmed to be a deliberate channeling of candidates toward a hazardous water crossing. Kelly's face had drained of color. His gaze shot toward Reynolds, who maintained his rigid posture, but whose eyes now held the calculating look of a man reassessing his strategic options. Colonel Warren stepped forward again. We've also taken statements from candidate Wilson and Staff Sergeant Cooper. Both confirm elements of this account. He turned toward Reynolds and Kelly. Do either of you wish to make a statement at this time? The silence stretched heavy with implication. Finally, Reynolds spoke, his voice controlled, but holding a new edge of defensiveness. I maintain that all decisions made during the exercise were within the scope of appropriate training parameters. If communication failures occurred during severe weather, that reflects the inherent challenges of field operations, not deliberate misconduct. Kelly said nothing, his gaze now fixed on the floor. Blackwood studied them both, his expression unreadable. This inquiry will recess for 30 minutes while the panel reviews the evidence presented. Reynolds, Kelly, you are to remain available in the adjacent room. Often as the two sergeants were escorted out, Claire caught Sullivan's eye across the room. The older officer gave an almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a task professionally executed. But this was only the beginning. The institutional resistance they were confronting wouldn't dissolve with a single inquiry, no matter how damning the evidence. Choya. The 30-minute recess extended to 45, then an hour. In a small office adjacent to the conference center, Claire reviewed her notes, ensuring every element of her testimony was supported by verifiable evidence. Experience had taught her that cases like this were often determined by the smallest details: a timestamp discrepancy, an inconsistent statement, a procedural technicality that could be exploited by those seeking to protect the status quo. A knock at the door announced Sullivan's arrival. He entered without waiting for a response, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Something's happening, he said, his voice low despite their privacy. Kelly requested a separate meeting with the JAG officers. Been in there for 20 minutes now. Claire nodded, understanding immediately. He's cutting a deal? Looks that way. Reynolds has been making calls, Pentagon connections, presumably. Expected, Claire replied, unsurprised. This was how the system typically protected itself: negotiated outcomes, reduced charges, quiet reassignments, rather than public accountability. Sullivan moved to the window, looking out over the parade ground where recruits continued their daily training routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding within the administrative buildings. You know how this usually plays out. I do. Claire closed her folder. But this time is different. Sullivan turned back to her, a question in his eyes. Because we're not just presenting evidence to the chain of command, she explained. The full report has already been transmitted to the Congressional Oversight Committee on Military Integration Programs. Regardless of today's outcome, there will be public accountability. A slow smile spread across Sullivan's weathered face. You've learned a thing or two since Kandahar. I had a good teacher, Claire replied, the ghost of a smile touching her own lips. Sullivan's expression sobered. Reynolds won't go down easily. Men like that never do. I'm counting on it, Claire said, rising from her desk. His resistance is part of the evidence. A chime from her secure tablet interrupted their conversation. Claire checked the incoming message, then looked up at Sullivan, her expression now completely professional. They're reconvening. Kelly has agreed to provide testimony in exchange for reduced charges. And Reynolds, well, we're about to find out. When Claire re-entered the conference room, she immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. The seating arrangement had been modified. Kelly now sat at a separate table with his newly assigned legal counsel. Reynolds occupied his original position, but his previously confident posture had hardened into something more defensive. His shoulders squared with the rigid bearing of a soldier preparing for an assault. Blackwood called the room to order with a sharp rap of his knuckles against the wooden table. This inquiry will now continue. Colonel Warren, you may proceed. Warren stood, his manner suggesting significant developments had occurred during the recess. Sergeant First Class Kelly has agreed to provide a sworn statement regarding the events in question. In exchange, JAG has agreed to recommend that charges be limited to Article 92 violations, dereliction of duty, rather than the more serious Article 134 charges. Reynolds' jaw tightened visibly at this announcement. Claire observed him closely, recognizing the calculated recalibration occurring behind his eyes. A battlefield commander assessing a suddenly changed tactical situation and formulating a new plan of engagement. Kelly rose when instructed, raised his right hand for the oath, then began his testimony. His voice initially wavered but steadied as he proceeded. Master Sergeant Reynolds instructed me to implement modified training protocols for candidates he had identified as problematic for the program. Kelly glanced briefly at Reynolds, then continued. This included candidate Wilson, who had questioned training methods, and the female candidates Chen and Martinez. We were directed to create conditions that would increase their likelihood of failure without appearing to directly target them. Warren guided Kelly through a series of specific questions, each response building a comprehensive picture of a systematic effort to undermine certain candidates through manipulated evaluation conditions. The most damning testimony came when Kelly described the events immediately preceding the storm. When the weather advisory came through, Reynolds instructed us to maintain normal protocols rather than implementing standard safety measures. He specifically said, let them figure it out. That's what selection is for. Reynolds remained stone-faced throughout Kelly's testimony, but his right hand had closed into a fist on the table before him, a small but telling indication of his internal state. When Kelly finished, Warren turned to Reynolds. Master Sergeant, do you wish to make a statement in response to this testimony? Reynolds rose slowly, his movements deliberately controlled. Sergeant Kelly's characterization of events is inaccurate. The modifications to the training program were within my authority as senior instructor and were designed to realistically challenge candidates under pressure. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. If communication failures occurred during the storm, they were the result of equipment limitations and environmental conditions, not deliberate negligence. Claire noted the careful phrasing, technical denial without directly contradicting the documented evidence. It was the approach of a veteran NCO who understood how to navigate bureaucratic systems and disciplinary proceedings. Colonel Warren seemed to recognize the strategy as well. Master Sergeant, the communication logs clearly show functional radio transmission with other field units after you reported all personnel accounted for. How do you reconcile this discrepancy? Different frequencies, different equipment, capabilities, Reynolds replied smoothly. Field communications are notoriously unreliable in adverse conditions. In the specific targeting of candidates Wilson, Chen, and Ramirez, I assign personnel based on balanced team compositions and training needs. Any perception of targeting is subjective interpretation, not established fact. Claire watched this exchange with professional detachment, recognizing the familiar pattern of technical denial and procedural deflection. Throughout her career, she had seen this approach succeed too many times, creating just enough doubt, just enough procedural ambiguity to avoid the most serious consequences. But not today. Blackwood signaled to a staff officer who distributed a new set of documents to the panel members. Before we continue with Master Sergeant Reynolds' testimony, I'm entering into evidence a complete performance analysis of the selection program over the past 3 years. Reynolds' expression flickered with momentary confusion, then concern. This analysis, Blackwood continued, reveals a statistically significant pattern of female candidates and male candidates who voice support for integration being eliminated from the program at rates far exceeding their peers, despite equivalent or superior performance metrics in objective evaluation categories. He turned directly to Reynolds. More specifically, candidates under your direct supervision show a 72% washout rate for female trainees compared to 23% for male trainees with equivalent qualification scores. Reynolds straightened. Different physical capabilities require different assessment standards, sir. Indeed, Blackwood agreed, which is why this analysis controls for those variables comparing candidates against established standards for their respective categories. He tapped the document before him. The pattern remains statistically impossible without deliberate interference. For the first time, genuine uncertainty showed on Reynolds' face, the recognition that the case against him extended far beyond the specific incident in the Ohari Mountains, encompassing his entire tenure as an instructor. Claire maintained her composed silence, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. This wasn't personal vindication she sought, but institutional accountability. Reynolds wasn't merely an individual with biased views. He represented a systemic problem that had persisted despite decades of official policies promoting integration and equal opportunity. Colonel Warren took control of the proceedings again. Based on the evidence presented, including documentation of falsified reports, testimony from multiple witnesses, communication logs, and the pattern analysis just introduced, this panel makes the following preliminary findings. The room fell silent as Warren read from his formal document. Sergeant First Class Kelly has acknowledged violations of Article 92 of the UCMJ. In exchange for his cooperation, we recommend referral to a special court-martial with negotiated sentencing parameters. He turned a page. Regarding Master Sergeant Reynolds, we find sufficient evidence to recommend referral to a general court-martial on charges of violating Articles 92-107 and 134 of the UCMJ. The evidence supports allegations of dereliction of duty, false official statements, and conduct endangering the welfare of personnel under his command. Reynolds remained rigidly at attention, his expression now completely closed, revealing nothing of his internal reaction to these findings. Master Sergeant Reynolds is hereby suspended from all instructional duties pending the convening of the court-martial. He will surrender all program materials and access credentials before departing this facility today. Warren closed his folder. This preliminary hearing is adjourned. As the room began to clear, Reynolds finally moved, gathering his materials with mechanical precision. When he looked up, his gaze locked with Claire's across the room. There was no overt hostility in his expression, but rather something more complex, a grudging recognition, perhaps, or the reassessment that comes when a capable opponent has outmaneuvered you. Claire held his gaze without triumph or antagonism. One professional acknowledging another across an unbridgeable divide of values and vision. Then Reynolds turned and departed, flanked by his legal counsel and the security detail that would escort him through the administrative processing his new status required. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows of Fort Bragg's Memorial Hall, illuminating the photographs and plaques that chronicled generations of service sacrifice and evolution. Claire stood before a relatively recent addition, a memorial to the women who had served in combat roles during the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts, their contributions officially recognized only after decades of unofficial participation in the nation's most challenging military operations. Footsteps echoed on the polished floor behind her, and she turned to find Wilson approaching, his uniform pressed, and his bearing now carrying a new confidence, the subtle transformation that comes from having faced genuine danger and emerged intact. "Major," he said, offering a crisp salute. "At ease, Wilson," Claire replied. "How's Ramirez?" "Walking with crutches, ma'am. Doctor says he'll be cleared for full duty in about 3 weeks." Wilson glanced at the memorial display. "I wanted to thank you, not just for the rescue, but for everything that followed." Claire studied the young soldier's face, recognizing something familiar in his expression, the particular blend of idealism and determination that characterized those who sought to serve honorably within imperfect systems. "You made the harder choice," she said simply. "Reporting misconduct within your chain of command is never the easy path." Wilson nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "I enlisted to be part of something that stands for certain values. If those values only apply when convenient, what's the point?" Claire allowed a small smile. "That's the question that separates good soldiers from great ones, Wilson." Before he could respond, General Blackwood entered the hall, accompanied by Sullivan and 2 officers Claire didn't immediately recognize. Blackwood gestured for them to join him by a conference table positioned beneath a large unit flag. "Major Hawkins, candidate Wilson," Blackwood said as they approached. "Allow me to introduce Colonel Peterson and Major Rivera from the Pentagon's Special Operations Training Oversight Committee." Handshakes were exchanged with professional courtesy. "They're here to discuss the future of our integration program," Blackwood continued, "particularly in light of recent events." He turned to Claire. "Major Hawkins, your evaluation was supposed to last 6 weeks. Despite being cut short, your findings have proven significantly more comprehensive than anticipated." Colonel Peterson, a lean officer with the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to high-level strategic planning, opened a folder on the table. "Your report has generated considerable interest at the highest levels, Major. The systematic nature of the resistance you uncovered suggests this isn't isolated to Fort Bragg." "It isn't," Claire confirmed. "The patterns are consistent across multiple training facilities and commands. Reynolds wasn't the disease, he was a symptom. Which is why," Peterson continued, "we're implementing a comprehensive review of all special operations selection programs with emphasis on evaluating potential bias in assessment protocols and instructor supervision." Major Rivera, a woman approximately Claire's age with intelligence behind her measured words, added, "We'd like you to lead that review. Major Hawkins, your background makes you uniquely qualified: operational experience, programmatic understanding, and demonstrated ability to identify institutional blind spots." Claire absorbed this offer, recognizing its significance. This wasn't a cosmetic response or a bureaucratic reshuffling. It represented genuine institutional commitment to addressing systemic problems. "The scope would be Pentagon-wide," she asked. "All branches, all special operations selection programs." Peterson confirmed, with direct reporting to the Secretary of Defense's office. Sullivan, who had remained silent during this exchange, allowed a small smile to form at the corner of his mouth. Satisfaction at seeing his former protege recognized at levels that had once seemed unattainable for operators like them, regardless of gender. Claire looked to Blackwood, whose expression conveyed understanding of the moment's weight. "What happens here at Fort Bragg in the interim, sir? I'll be personally overseeing the restructuring of our assessment programs," Blackwood replied, "starting with the promotion of Lieutenant Mitchell to captain and her appointment as interim training director." He glanced at Wilson, "and the immediate reinstatement of all candidates whose evaluations may have been compromised by the previous leadership." Wilson straightened, slightly professional satisfaction evident despite his attempt to maintain proper military bearing. Claire considered the offer before her. Throughout her career, she had fought individual battles against a system that often seemed designed to resist the very changes it officially endorsed. This opportunity represented something different, the chance to address root causes rather than symptoms, to establish new foundations, rather than simply patching cracks in existing structures. "I accept," she said finally, "with one condition." Peterson's eyebrow raised slightly. "Which is?" "Colonel Sullivan joins the review team as senior advisor." Claire glanced at her mentor. "His institutional knowledge spans 4 decades of special operations evolution. That perspective is invaluable." Sullivan's expression registered surprise, followed by something deeper. The recognition that his life's work would continue to shape the institution he had served for nearly half a century, even as that institution evolved in directions he might once have questioned. Peterson and Rivera exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. "Approved," Peterson said. "You'll both receive formal orders by end of week." As the meeting concluded and the officers began to disperse, Sullivan lingered, waiting until they were alone before speaking. "Didn't see that coming," he said, a hint of wry amusement in his voice. "Seemed appropriate," Claire replied. "The future needs to understand the past, not erase it." Sullivan nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "I was wrong, you know. About when you first joined Delta, I had my doubts. Not about your capability, I'd seen that firsthand, but about whether the unit was ready, whether the system could bend without breaking." He gazed around the memorial hall, his eyes tracing the visual chronicle of military evolution captured in the displays. "Turns out systems are like soldiers, they adapt when they must, not when it's comfortable." Claire followed his gaze, seeing not just the memorials that existed, but the spaces where future achievements would someday be recognized. The best ones do. They walked together toward the exit, 2 soldiers from different eras united by shared values that transcended the changing forms of the institution they served. Outside, the Fort Bragg parade ground stretched before them, where a new group of candidates was running drills. Under Mitchell's supervision, men and women moving with the synchronized precision that came from shared purpose and unified training. Claire watched them for a moment, then turned her gaze toward the administration building, where hours earlier, accountability had finally outweighed protection and where the foundations of genuine change had been laid. The phantom of Delta Force, the unofficial, unacknowledged female operator, would soon exist only in the history books, replaced by the documented reality of women serving openly wherever their capabilities led them. It wasn't the end of resistance or the final victory of progress over tradition. Such absolute outcomes existed only in simplified narratives, not in the complex reality of human institutions. But it was a significant step, one that had been decades in the making, purchased with the perseverance of countless women who had served in shadows before finally stepping into the light. As Claire watched the candidates execute their drills with disciplined precision, Sullivan voiced the thought that had formed in her mind. "They'll never know what it took to get here," he said quietly. Claire nodded, understanding the multiple layers of his observation, the personal sacrifices, the institutional battles, the slow evolution of perspectives that had once seemed immutable. They shouldn't have to. And that ultimately was the measure of genuine progress, not that barriers were overcome, but that future generations would never know they had existed at all.